Welcome to Accept Your Gifts, the 22-minute podcast for inspiring your most creative life. My name is Tracy Crow. I'm an author, writing coach, and Marine Corps veteran. I'm looking forward to co-creating today's show with you. So if you're ready, are you ready? I'm ready. So if you're ready to live a more creative, more magical life, let's get started. Hello, everyone. My special guest this week for another two-part series is Navy veteran Jeffery Hess, author of the novels Tushhog Beachhead and the story collection War Canoe Club, as well as editor of the award-winning anthologies Home of the Brave, Stories in Uniform, and Home of the Brave, Somewhere in the Sand. Now, Jeff served 6 years aboard the Navy's oldest and newest ships and has held writing positions at a daily newspaper, a Fortune 500 company, and a university-based research center. He holds writing degrees from Queen's University of Charlotte and the University of South Florida. Jeff's writing has appeared widely in print and online. He lives in Florida, where he leads the DD 214 Writers Workshop for military veterans. But I first met Jeff 16 years ago while we were both graduate students of the Queen's University of Charlotte Creative Writing Master of Fine Arts program. We've been dear friends ever since and writing advocates and mentors to one another. I asked Jeff to join us this week for a craft discussion related to writing fiction because you see, Jeff possesses an innate ability for turning nuggets of history into literary gold. And such is the case with his exciting forthcoming novel titled No Salvation. Now, I'll share a brief description about this exceptional novel from the publisher. Quote, inspired by actual events, No Salvation features the USS Salvation as it sails for months on end in the South China Sea in the violent closing days of the Vietnam War. Exhaustion, drugs, and discontent run rampant aboard ship, and crew morale is at an all-time low. These conditions affect 4,000 men being sequestered for months on end without port visits, and everyone is on edge. Now, this is 1972, a time when inequality and racial tension permeated ships fleet-wide. As a way to mitigate racial unrest, the ship's captain brings in Commander Robert Porter as his executive officer. Commander Porter isn't sure if he's been selected for the job because of his skills or for the color of his skin, but the black crew doesn't accept him. Amid rampant drug use and various forms of sabotage, the biggest challenge to the ship's performance and the crew's safety is a series of violent attacks made by planes launching from the flight deck. But more perilous are the racial tensions boiling below. Porter is uniquely positioned to save them all, but can he? If so, at what cost? Unquote. So let's listen in as I quiz Jeff a little bit about how he knew this was a story he was meant to write. And if you'll return Thursday, you'll hear Jeff, who has this legendary reputation for work ethic and accuracy, also share a few life lessons he's gleaned over the years about writing and about life. Okay, here we go. Hey, Jeff, thanks so much for agreeing to be with us today on Accept Your Gifts.
Well, I've never said no to you. Why would I start now? And actually, I'm a huge fan of the show. I've never missed an episode, although today's episode I'm going to listen to tonight, so I'm one behind technically, but other than that, I'm right along with you.
You know, you are my greatest advocate. There is no doubt about it. And I've already told our listeners a little bit about our connection and our background and how much fun we had in West Virginia at the Wounded Warrior Project workshop that we just held. Wasn't that a blast?
That was amazing. Yeah, it was a great experience.
And now we have a closed Facebook group with those veterans, and it's taking off. I'm so tickled every day when I see someone post some of their writing or a share. I think we did some good work, friend. I think we did.
I think a lot of people responded very favorably, and we got through and it made some new writers out of some people that were a little bit reticent.
Yeah, I agree. Well, listen, as you know, I've been doing so many of these podcast programs about uncovering our real truths and using memoir writing or personal essay timelines, which is today's show, by the way, that you'll hear tonight. But you've heard me talk about this before. And the reason I wanted to have you on is because you do something so well. You take real life, like a nugget from real life, and you turn it into fiction. And I know we have writers out there who are probably thinking, I don't know if I would really be comfortable sharing some of my personal life and under the label of nonfiction or memoir, but I wonder if I could fictionalize it and still make a story out of it. You've got a new book coming out, No Salvation. Let's talk a little bit about that. Tell our listeners why you chose that particular subject and where from history you drew from.
Well, that was something that I discovered while I was researching stories for my short story collection called War Canoe Club, which was obviously all about the Cold War era. And that's the era in which I served in the Navy. And so I was writing Navy stories about the Cold War, and I found myself using my own experience and fictionalizing parts of that. And being somewhat of a crime writer as well, I was injecting a lot of that as well. But then I figured there's a lot more to that era of the Cold War, from 49 to technically, 91, although some would say 89, which is when I got out after the Berlin Wall came down. I don't take a whole lot of credit for that, but a little bit. But the era seemed to be opening up to me as I was writing these stories. And so I was researching a story about 1949 with a submarine that sank. And while I was doing that, somehow I stumbled upon some issues that were occurring in 1972 during the Vietnam War. And Vietnam is its own war in its own era, but it's still part of the Cold War period. And so what I figured I would do is put that on hold. But I was still so compelled to look into it, and I kept researching it kind of on the side. And so I was torn in two different directions because I was trying to stay on track, but I was so fascinated with this material. I was finding information about a huge race component with a number of aircraft carriers and a couple of oilers, that there was a racial unrest and even riots. But there was also instances of sabotage and widespread drug reuse. And so I figured I have to do something with this. And so I wrote a story that was included in Cold War Canoe Club that focuses on the racial component, but it wasn't enough room to encapsulate everything. And so I said, that's going to be a novel. And so shortly after I finished the stories for the collection, I began work on the novel. That's been 5 years in the making. And it just opened up so much, and I found so much information that I had to include, that I figured that it was timely in that with the race component going on even today, it was even more vital then after all the stuff going on with the civil rights movement. And it kind of just pulled me in that direction. And so I was able to, with multiple characters, include multiple stories and multiple storylines to work in the various components of the race, of the sabotage, of the drug use, and racism in general. And it was a labor of love that I just really enjoyed the process of writing.
Well, you call it a labor of love, and it certainly shows on every single page. It is masterfully written. And I just have to know, was there at some point any level of trepidation about writing this sort of material, the racial riots, the sabotage, aboard this naval vessel? I mean, was there any level of trepidation that said, I don't know about walking across that water in that way?
Yes and no. I think and one aspect of the writing, I'm totally against censorship in any form. I think everybody is allowed to write any story they want to write, and I'm a huge proponent of that. And every book should be published, every book should be read, every book should be allowed. And so I've written stories with a female protagonist, so why not have a story with a African American protagonist? I don't see any distinction as long as the research is accurate and everything's portrayed in a way that conveys an intention that is true to the actual story, if it is based on fact. And obviously, No Salvation is inspired by actual events. But the issue of trepidation, that wasn't until the book was already written. And I was online one day, and I found a freelance editor who was open to sampling like an opening chapter, the first 100 pages, whatever it was. And she read it and got back to me saying that there might be issues in publishing based on a white man writing about a black man. And I disagreed with her completely, but I understood her position. And I don't know how, like, obviously the book hasn't come out yet and it's still out for review, so I haven't received a whole lot of editorial review yet. But I wasn't concerned because I know I'm accurate. I know I'm capturing what one of my idols, Tim O'Brien, calls the emotional truth. And I think as long as you stick to that, you can't go wrong.
I am so thrilled to hear you talk about this subject. In fact, I didn't even know we were going to go in this particular direction. So yay us. I'm really glad, because I have sat in recent conferences with other writers and literary conferences, and I have heard out and out arguments and debates over this thing of appropriating culture, appropriating another culture, and writers literally, no pun intended, bashing one another because someone has crossed some sort of cultural line in the sand. Just like you said, if you're a white man writing about an African American, it's not allowed. You know that I wrote Cooper's Hawk, The Remembering, and the main character, it has Native American background, and I'm not Native American. I thought I was, but that's not the real truth. You know, those family stories don't always hold up. But the thing is that I worried for the longest time and refused to write that book because I did not want to be accused of appropriating another culture, and I didn't want to put myself through all of that. And then finally I realized I had no choice. I really had to write this book and just put it out there. So where do you think that comes from for you, that you feel so solid about having the right to write the story that comes to you? And what would you say to other writers out there who are like I was for a long time? I don't know.
I think most of all, it's a rejection of censorship of any kind, and the freedom. You know, there's academic freedom, and I also think there's literary freedom. I think we should all be allowed to write what we have in us. And this is a story that I had in me. Between my Navy experience, it's a Navy story. The African American component, the racial component, is stuff that I've learned through research that I read. I mean, I have boxes of material that I comb through, newspaper articles, books, congressional reports, some of the cruise books from some Navy ships, all this information. So I feel I'm in a position to portray it somewhat accurately between a combination of fact with research, with just good old-fashioned imagination as well. The combination of those, again, with the emotional truth in mind, I don't think a writer can go wrong with that. Again, the general public might disagree, or some portions might disagree. Well, that remains to be seen. But I feel that anything you have in you that you're passionate about, that you want to convey, that should be on the table. There should be no censorship.
No,
Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Quite well, thank you. And I think we'll send it to the Association of Writers and Professional Writing Programs, AWP. Hey, listen, one of the things that I've noticed in No Salvation that you do so masterfully is it never takes the reader into any one direction of rooting for one side or the other. How aware were you of maintaining that amazing balance? Were you at all, or I'll just stop. How aware were you?
Figuratively, not at all. It's just the way I am. I have no bias, so I figured I would just write, and it turned out to be pretty much unbiased and relatively balanced, because I wanted to present a case of just showing what had happened at that time. Again, this is 1972. The world was different. Yeah, I had to use some language that we wouldn't use today, but it was popular at the time. There's some opinions, but there's a balance because of the number of characters that are in the book. And I think that was endemic of the population as a whole, because it's a microcosm, right? A ship is a microcosm of a corporation. Corporation's a microcosm of the world. And so it's just a multicultural experience, a personality experience. And so by representing certain segments, I mean, there's racists, there's the put upon, there's those who are trying to find their way, those who've fallen by the wayside. And I think that's just life. And so when you approach it that way as kind of an observer, in a sense, I'm serving as a reporter. I'm fictionalizing things that actually happened. And I do this somewhat in fiction, my crime fiction as well, because it's based on not actual people, but it's based on actual events that happen quite often, especially in Florida. The Florida fiction that I write, crazy things happen. And so on a ship, anything can happen. And so by taking fact and combining it with imagination, there's really no limits. And I think that that's just kind of the way the world is, but it gives a certain order to the world. And there's a certain outcome that naturally took its place, because I didn't ascribe an ending to the story. It just came the way it was supposed to for those characters, which is not exactly the way it happened in real life, but that's the way it happened for these characters.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that that's not the way it happened in real life. And this is what that freedom of writing fiction allows you to do. So you take that nugget, that motivation behind the story, and then you allow the story to reveal itself for you on the page. So for all those listening who are wondering about that, just because something is based on real life doesn't mean that you have to adhere to every single element of chronologically how it happened, right?
Absolutely. And that's one thing that our mutual friend and teacher, Fred LeBron, told me when I first announced to him that I was going to write this book. He said, don't be handcuffed by the facts. Because that's the worst thing that could happen to fiction. And so therefore I was allowed to experiment and to incorporate some things purely from imagination, which still are grounded in possibility, but it's still fiction. And so I never lost sight of the fact that it was fiction, but I also try to be true to honor the element. And again, I get back to that concept of emotional truth.
Right. Okay, let's talk about your protagonist, Porter, who has got to be one of my all-time favorite fictional characters ever.
And rapidly becoming one of mine as well.
Wow. Okay. So is he based on real life, or is he just totally imagined for this role? Because let me tell you, he's memorable. Oh my gosh, Jeff.
He is largely based on an actual person who was actually the executive officer of the USS Kitty Hawk. And he was a black man who was put in this position largely for the same reasons. And he reacted to a degree in a similar way. And it was just too powerful to ignore. And it was too story worthy to not use. And so I took liberties. Again, it's a different person. It's a fictional character. So similarities could perhaps be there, but it was my own character that I made. I made him my own and his own. And I think that's why he was so enjoyable to write.
Oh, he really is. He will be very memorable. Let me ask you, in the movie version of your head of No Salvation, who would you cast to play Porter?
You know, that's an interesting question. I've never really considered actual people based on my characters before. But this one, was so strongly formed. And by having seen a number of movies, the first thing that comes to mind is Denzel Washington, but this was 1972. And so he'd been a little young at that time, or if it's being filmed now, he's a little old for that role. But Jamie Foxx is another character that really comes to mind. I mean, you could see Idris Elba, you could see Michael B. Jordan. There's a whole host of actual actors that could be portrayed in that role, because it's a strong black man who questions himself, who is simultaneously confident in his abilities, yet insecure for the reasons for his position.
Exactly, because he is working for a captain who is terrifying, actually.
Aren't all captains terrifying?
I don't know. I was in the Marine Corps, so you were on a ship. So
well, NE06, insert NE06 here,
NE06.
And you find there's a little bit of terror behind that, right?
Yeah, but I mean, this man is, I'm not going to say he's evil, but because, you beautifully blend so much into the complexity of characters that nobody is ever, just, two-dimensional. But where did he come from?
He was based on a little bit, again, I had some facts of, it's kind of a synthesis. The whole book is kind of a synthesis of many actual people who took place. Because again, there was 4 or 5 ships that had these racial incidents. And so I was able to take from all the newspaper articles and all of the research that I did, was able to take bits and pieces of each captain of each ship, and utilize some of those details. But again, with the imagination at play, I figured, okay, he's from Mississippi. He went to the University of Mississippi. He happens to have a rebel flag tattoo above his heart, because Ole Miss Rebels are, is his alma mater. And so he's naturally going to be inclined to represent that. But he is not and the real antagonist is a senior chief, and they're not as racist as you would think. They just think they're doing the right thing. And the captain's mission is the ultimate goal. He doesn't want anything to disrupt the mission of the ship, which is launching planes for ground support for the troops in country. And because they're almost a year at sea, he knows his whole crew is fatigued. He knows everybody is stretched too thin, but he is so adamant about maintaining mission readiness that everything else must be secondary. And while that is admirable in some ways, it is also neglectful in some ways. And that duality is something that really appealed to me. And that just makes for an interesting character.
Yeah, he certainly is interesting. Well, let me ask you this. I don't want to create any spoilers because I want everybody to read this book. But do you have a particular personal wish as a takeaway for your readers?
A takeaway for the readers, I think, would be, if I, off the top of my head, it would be to realize how far we've come. There's still a lot of work to be done in many ways, but considering, because I was, 6 years old in 1972, so I was a child, but the ground that we've covered, the progress that we've made, and the condition that the world is in now. Even when I was in my active duty era was from I signed up in '83, I got out in '89, and I didn't notice a single solitary racial issue in my enlistment. And so that's 9 years. Well, I'm sorry, 11 years from 72 to 83. That's 11 years. That's how bad I am at math. And I didn't notice any racial discontent or problems. And that was conquered in allegedly Admiral Zumwalt. But the time from 1909 to today has been leaps and bounds beyond that. But there's still discontent, and there's still problems, there's still issues. But I would like people to recognize and to understand nothing's perfect, nothing will ever be perfect, but a lot of ground has been covered and a lot of progress has been made.
So you think it's helpful, given the current climate of things, to recognize that particular period in history and to kind of see it in context
of value for where we are and what's moving around us with all the noise of today?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's the key. And that's the one thing that I hope everybody would get.
I'm afraid this is where we have to stop today. But if you'll return Thursday, you'll hear more from Jeff as he describes the value of a writing workshop, and he'll even share his own writing process, which includes a few incredibly valuable life lessons for more than a few of us. I hope you enjoyed today's co-creative listening experience. Please remember to leave a comment about the single greatest takeaway for you today. You know, that one thing you will remember from this day forward. Was it something funny or provocative? Was it just what you needed to hear? Please share so we can all benefit. And remember to return Tuesdays and Thursdays to accept your gifts, the 22-minute podcast for inspiring your most creative life.